During lockdown, I found a little corner in my garden behind my shed, and I squeezed a chair in it with my laptop, and I sat there and I would write until my children found out that that's where I was disappearing to. So I've written in the toilet, I've written in my office with my child under the table, giving them some coloring to do. So you just have to, I think, say this matters to me and just be able to fit it around the life that you have.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Collected, the Royal Literary Fund podcast where we explore the writing life from every angle. I'm Sonia Faleiro, a writer and RLF fellow. Here on Collected, we bring special guests into conversation with the wealth of archive material the RLF has gathered over the last decade or so. An extraordinary range of writers discussing the craft, hustle, and the deeply personal experiences behind their work. It's a unique opportunity to hear the real stories and struggles that often go unspoken. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking with the formidable Pragya Agarwal. Pragya is a writer, and she's also a behavioural and data scientist, as well as a relentless advocate for women's rights and social justice. You would have come across her books: Sway, Unraveling Unconscious Bias, Motherhood, and most recently, Hysterical, Exploding the Myth of Gendered Emotions. Pragya's work urges us to question the deeply ingrained assumptions we carry and to understand how bias can shape our thinking and institutions in often invisible ways. Pragya, I'm thrilled you could join us and Collected. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you, Sonia. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Let us dive right in. Pragya, you moved from India to the UK to pursue your studies, and I know from personal experience that journey can be exhilarating and daunting, especially when you're nurturing a writing career in a completely different cultural and geographical context. Which brings us to our first clip. Here's Helen Grant reflecting on how finding a local library in Scotland helped her feel grounded after her move.
For me as a writer, location has a very great significance. It's not an exaggeration to say that it is the biggest source of inspiration for my work. Over the years, I and my family have moved a number of times, from England to Germany, from Germany to Flanders, and in 2011 to Scotland. These locations have been the backdrops to my novels. My first novel, The Vanishing of Katharina Linden, was inspired by my experiences living in Badminster Eiffel. Since then, I've increasingly sought out interesting local settings for my writing. I visited ancient churches, castles, deserted railway tunnels, an abandoned factory, and the Brussels sewers. When I'm visiting an atmospheric location, I experience it as a kind of empty stage set, waiting for the actors to walk onto it and tell their story. The details of the setting suggest to me what that story might be. The years we spent in Germany and Flanders were very creatively productive for me, and they were very happy years for me personally. When we decided to move to Scotland, I felt a certain amount of trepidation. I knew it was the right thing for us as a family. For my husband, who was born here, it was a chance to introduce our children to his home country. If you keep moving around, it's easy to end up feeling as though you don't really belong anywhere, and he wanted them to discover their Scottish roots. For me, things were rather different. I'd never lived here before. If I'm honest, I wondered whether I would fit in. Would it ever feel like home to me? I was willing to try, but that feeling of unease was still there. One of the first places I visited after we had settled into our new home was the library of Innerpeffray. I stumbled across it by chance. Whenever we arrived in a new place, I always joined the library, so I Googled local libraries, and it was one of the ones that came up. I knew it had a collection of antiquarian books, but other than that, I didn't really know anything about it. I thought it would be a fairly old building on the main street of a small town, surrounded by shops and businesses. When I drove over there, I was very surprised to discover that the library is pretty much in the middle of nowhere. I followed the signs and I kept thinking that I would get to the centre of Innerpeffray, but there isn't really a centre. It's a tiny hamlet with a few buildings dotted around. To get to the library itself, you have to go about 1 kilometre down a tiny lane. When you get to the end, There is the old schoolhouse, the chapel and the library, just surrounded by fields. The library is housed in an 18th century building. The downstairs has now been renovated, but when I first visited, there were only the upstairs reading rooms. Visitors go up a flight of stone stairs. At the top, there is a little area with a visitor's book and a heavy wooden door which opens into the bigger reading room. I don't know exactly what I was expecting, but when I opened the door, I was amazed and charmed all at once. It was like going into a library in a country house. There are old-fashioned wooden bookcases running from the floor almost to the ceiling, crammed with leather-bound books, and in the centre of the room there are glass cases with books of special interest on display. The library has antiquarian books in English, Greek, Latin, French, German, Dutch. Visiting Innerpeffray Library was like stepping into one of the ghost stories of M.R. James, and that is an environment that is very familiar to me. I immediately felt as though I belonged there. That was a very important moment for me.
I love any conversation that involves a library, so I really enjoyed Helen Grant on that. So Helen talks about amazement and charm in terms of the transition that she made. She also talks about trepidation and belonging. I wonder how you saw your transition from India to the UK personally, but also professionally. What kind of challenges did you face? But also, was there something wonderful about moving someplace completely new?
Yeah, I think all of those things, and I agree with you. Libraries have been such a comfort blanket for me, and I also join a new library whenever I move to a new place. But in terms of moving from India to the UK, I think professionally it was exciting because it offered me a really new and exciting and wonderful opportunity to study in a different context. I was undergoing a lot of quite stressful personal circumstances, so in a way, I felt like I was running away from them, and I could reinvent myself. I could be somebody completely new, not caught up in those circumstances and those situations back in India. So in that way, it was really wonderful discovering the snow for the first time and the different kinds of food. I actually wrote an essay for a literary magazine about the different kinds of food. When I first visited the supermarket here, there was a sense of trepidation and nervousness because I didn't recognize any of the foods. The climate, the weather, and how I felt about it because it was dark at 3 o'clock up in York when I was doing my master's. But I was also a single parent, and I had to leave my child behind with my parents for a little while because I couldn't financially bring her over here with me. And so that felt like I was broken up or split into half because a part of me was always torn back in India. And that made me more committed towards my professional career, I suppose. But this idea of not feeling at home, I think initially you try and conform to the things that are here, the frameworks, and try and fit in because you feel like grateful for the opportunities you've been given. And so this sense of gratitude is there that I can't create a fuss, I can't complain, I need to be able to fit into this framework. And it's taken a long time for me to be able to say and to challenge some of those things that I initially accepted and initially tried to conform to. So yeah, I think moving to a new place is always a mixture of wonder and amazement and discovering new things, new language, new foods, new ways of life. But also there is a process of sometimes maybe losing parts of yourself that you really valued. And I think sometimes we value assimilation rather than integration. When we move to a new place, like you have to assimilate within the environment that you're in rather than integrate and bring your whole self to it. And I think that is something I think we all have to perhaps consider, not just the people who move, but the people who are already there, how they welcome those new ideas from people who've moved there, I suppose.
I'm really moved by that because I'm an immigrant twice over. I moved from India when I was in my early 30s, first to the United States, and then from the United States I moved to London. But I've been in London for 10 years now, so, I'm a Londoner now through and through. But the things you said were so powerful and they just felt so familiar to me. And I think what really impressed me about your honesty is the fact that I've known you professionally for a few years now. We've never met, but I know of you on social media and as a columnist and somebody with a very strong voice. So where did that Pragya come from? How did she go from feeling like she has to conform and express gratitude to saying, hey, listen up?
Thank you for all that, Sonia. And likewise, I really respect and admire the work you do. In terms of finding my voice, I think the voice is always there within us. It's a matter of being brave enough to say, I need to be heard, that I need to speak up, that this is me. And I think sometimes it can take a little while, especially if you're moving around, or especially if you're in an unfamiliar situation or circumstance, or especially if you're overcoming some personal challenges where your voice might have been suppressed. So voices can be suppressed, as you know, institutionally or socially or culturally, interpersonally. And I think maybe age helps when you start thinking, I don't really care. To be my whole self makes me happy. I think that's what people have to realize, that unless we bring our whole self, unless we are able to speak up what we really think, we'll not be completely happy. And that's the whole thing about mental health, and well-being becomes more important as you grow older. But I suppose it was also a way of saying, hey, I've got 3 children, and it's a way of saying, actually, if I don't speak up for myself, how can I teach them to speak up for themselves? And so it wasn't the main thing that motivated me, but it is one of really important things in my life as a mother, as a parent, to model some of those behaviors that I'm trying to teach. So to actually walk the walk and not just talk the talk, and say, actually, you need to speak up for yourself. You need to be your whole self. You shouldn't be embarrassed about being your whole self. You need to challenge some of the things that are oppressive or marginalizing. That has really helped me. It can veer into benevolence, but sometimes I feel like if I don't speak up for certain people who are marginalized, who will?
Let's pivot to a topic that's absolutely crucial in contemporary publishing, a topic that you have spoken about, unconscious bias. Writers from diverse backgrounds often discover hidden barriers, sometimes in the form of marketing assumptions, sometimes in the way their work is pigeonholed, or simply in the scarcity of people who understand their perspective. To explore this further, we have a short clip of Gabriel Badamose asking British-Nigerian playwright Dipo Agbulaje about how race factors into navigating British theatre.
This makes me kind of think that perhaps you might be impatient discovering a situation in Britain in which there's such a thing as black theatre as distinct from what? White theatre? How do you deal with the whole kind of issue around kind of black race here in Britain when it comes to making work?
It's a thorny issue. Before I started writing in England, I used to attend a lot of theatre conferences that dealt with the situation of black British theatre. And it was very hard at first, me coming from Nigeria, from a country where race was not the issue in terms of access to maybe the stage or anything else. And then to come to England and then see that this was actually a big problem. And so for me, I remember once saying, well, at one conference, speaking up and saying, I can understand where we're all coming from, but I think maybe the only way through this is the kind of autonomy that you have in say, African American theatre, where they have their own urban circuit, which is sort of derogatory, was known as the Chitlin circuit. It's the only way, because I couldn't see how we could transform or change the existing power structures in a way that would allow us to grow and to develop. Then that the only way I thought was a kind of separation, a kind of segregation that allowed us to create a black aesthetic of theatre. Because every time, what I was hearing all the time was, the power to create work and determine what kind of shows or kind of plays that would be put on the big main stages were always determined by people who were not conversant with the culture. They determined what made a good play, what made a classic play. They determined what made the canon. And so for me, I thought the problem there was maybe we should start thinking of building our own institutions. Maybe we should start thinking, I think like the African Americans have a very strong tradition, not just of creating work, but also of critiquing it. The ideologies, the theories, the massive intellectual support from their fellow African Americans, which there wasn't as much of. There was. It wasn't that there wasn't, there was. But it didn't seem to gain as much visibility. So the question for me then was more to do with pragmatism. It was never a rejection of the situation of what was going on in Britain. It was, well, what do we do next?
So, Pragya, so much to mine there. Deepo talks about the idea, well, the practice of access being a problem, how perhaps one way to deal with the problem is a separation, which is, in his case, Black theatre artists who create their own structures and institutions. And he talks about how one of the many advantages of having that community is intellectual support. Mm-hmm. Underlining his conversation is the fact that people of color, and we are talking in our case specifically of publishing, are not received on the same terms as white writers. Mm-hmm. So I guess the question that I have for you is about your experience with publishing here in the UK. Can you talk about that and perhaps some challenges you may have faced and how you approach them?
This was a really powerful thing to hear, actually, about how challenging existing structures can be exhausting, and how we can overturn that by creating our own institutions and structures where we don't have to keep constantly challenging them. I came from academia into publishing, so it was a completely different world for me. It took a lot of learning, and I didn't know what to expect or what is the norm and what I should just take for granted. Initially, when I was applying to agents, querying agents, there was somebody who said to me, I already have an Indian writer on my books. And it made me wonder about how we are homogenized into this big kind of sense of Indian writer. And so if there is one Indian writer, you can't have another Indian writer because it is assumed that we are all bringing our own one perspective, and the way we write is just like in a singular way. And then there are other things like, I suppose, similarly, not just about race, but I was submitting my book Motherhood, which was about hybrid memoir about as a mother and talking about intersectionality in parenting and mothering, but also reproductive justice and white matters. And again, there were lots of pushback saying, oh, we've had a lot of mothering books. I already have a book about mothering. I already have a book about memoir about mothering. And I wasn't seeing many brown and Black women writing about these issues, or even talking about intersectionality. So it really made me wonder about how there is just actually, it is true, it's a cliche, but there's one seat at the table and we're all vying for it. And we are expected to write certain things. So at times I was told that, oh, we are really interested in your experience about growing up in India and how oppressive that was, while I wanted to write about the joy of certain things. And it's like almost kind of mining your trauma for the sake of publishing, or it's assumed that readers only want to read certain things. And I think that perception and that assumption really harms diversity of voices and writing in the publishing industry. And although things are changing a little bit, and that we are seeing more kind of diverse voices, there are certain things that you're expected to write about that is more assumed to be more interesting to the writers. And I read this amazing kind of a graphic essay by somebody, the name escapes me, about a Korean writer who said, I don't want to just write about what my name means, or I don't want to just write about the pain that my parents went through when they immigrated to a different country. I don't want to just write about that. I want to write about what white writers write. I just want to write about my dog, or I want to write about the wonder or the joy or other things, just normal things. And also, I think as another thing that I encountered was, it's assumed that the readers are only readers who understand English, and they don't are not exposed to different languages. So as an Indian writer who speaks Hindi, I sometimes included Hindi statements in my work. And I was asked to either italicize them or I explain or translate them in the footnote. And one thing I tried to really rebelled against it in a way was to not italicize a different language things by, and that is also a form of othering because it others the language, is assumed that it's only English is the norm. We are writing in English, we're working in that, but it's okay to write in different languages. And I also didn't provide translations. I said people can use Google Translate if they want to use the Translate. I don't want to make it stand out. So that is a way of challenging the norm of who the reader is and also overturning the frameworks that we have to operate within. I think intellectual solidarity is really very, very important, especially if you're from a marginalized community, because it's not just about representation. It's about showing the way to others. It's about saying, I have overcome these challenges. I can ease the way for you so you don't have to. And things like you do with South Asia Speaks is so wonderful because that's exactly what it does. But I do think that there is also that form of insecurity among people who are marginalized or from a marginalized community because they feel like if there's only one seat at the table and we're all vying for that, then it creates that competition rather than a solidarity. We need to make the table bigger. We need to put more seats at the table. We need to stop defining writers in terms of Black writer, Indian writer, South Asian writer. That is not my primary identity, although I bring all those experiences to my writing.
Yeah. I mean, I love that you spoke about intellectual solidarity because that is something we can actually do for each other rather than feeling that marginalization and using it against one another, using it to slam the door behind us. Yeah. We can make sure that door's open and use all of these incredible gifts that we have together to build structures that really build us up. Because one of the things that you always find when writers of color get together is we'll joke about something that an agent has said or a publisher has said. But under those jokes, there is a real pain that we aren't allowed to be who we are, that our intellect, our talent, our abilities are all defined by the color of our skin or by our cultural origins. You talked about South Asia Speaks, which is a literary mentorship that I created for emerging writers in South Asia. And the great writer Kamila Shamsi, who also won the Women's Prize, was a guest at one of the masterclasses that we host. And Kamila was talking about one of her early books being bought by a publisher in the US. And when Kamila went over to meet the publisher, the publicist took her aside and said, you're going to have to tell me how to market your book. I mean, how do I reach your community? And Kamila was a younger writer then, newer to the business, so she didn't say anything. And later on, she thought, my community is readers. You must know how to reach readers. And again, this person goes on to win the biggest prize in publishing. She perseveres. But how many writers can persevere in the fact of constantly being pushed back? So thank you for the advice for intellectual solidarity.
No, I do think that it's exhausting to keep pushing back against these challenges that you face. And sometimes we can internalize them and feel like we must not be a good writer or we are not suitable or we are not going to be right for this community and for the publishing. So I think when somebody holds your hand and say, it's okay, I went through the same thing, or it's okay to not be okay with this, I think that is a really important form of solidarity.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. We are going to stick to the subject of challenges because one of the first things you and I talked about when you came into the studio was our kids and how much we had achieved just this morning before getting to our work, our paying jobs. So as parents, we are not just juggling our work and the various aspects of that work. We are also juggling caring for other people. What impact does that have on one's creativity? Does that spur you to write more, or is it crushing? Let's talk about that after this clip from writer Rupa Farooqi, who reflects on writing when her children were young. She gives us a really candid glimpse of how she carved out some precious writing time in a very busy household.
Perhaps it seems obvious, but what a writer most needs in order to write is time. Most novelists start off and carry on with day jobs to pay the bills and to give us a reason to brush our teeth and get out of the house in the morning. And I'm no different. So it feels that much of my writing career has been defined by how I've tried to carve my writing time out of an over-diaried day. When I was career building in my 20s, what kept my writing on track was being put on the tracks. My office sent me on a secondment, which involved a 2-hour daily commute by rail. In the days before everywhere internet, that gave me the time to start my first full-length novel, and the discipline training of writing for 2 hours every morning was invaluable. That early experience also taught me to be completely unfussy about my writing environment. I realised that as long as I had a seat and a laptop, I could write almost anywhere. Now, when I go back over passages of my novels, I remember exactly where I was when I wrote them. The back of a bookstore in Bergerac, waiting to be called for an event. A hotel bathroom in Bilbao while my children were sleeping. My in-law's sitting room in the spare hour before dinner. The bus to Oxford on my way to lecture. And the kitchen at home, looking out over the elderflowers. When that secondment finished, I took a 6-month sabbatical to travel with my husband, and that was probably the most indulgent writing experience I've ever had. No financial pressure, as I didn't have an audience, publisher or agent, so I was really writing just for me. No time pressure, as I could write whenever I wanted. But then we had our first child, and another in quick succession, and then we had twins. My novel was accepted with a 2-book contract, extended to a 3rd, and then 4th. And I had to go back to work to make ends meet, while my husband retrained in teaching. I remember writing my 5th novel with 4 children under 5, between 3-hour breastfeeds, lecturing and marking papers while they slept. My writing time was pushed to the end of the day, and I'd frequently find that I was peeling myself off my laptop in the early hours, having fallen asleep writing, often mid-sentence. A university colleague advised me to stop writing so late. Write early, she said. Really, really early. I remembered that first writing experience on the train from 6 to 8 a.m. every morning. I decided to try it again. And it worked brilliantly. So now I'm up at 5 a.m. every morning and I write for 2 hours before the children are up and the demands of the working day take over. I've got in the habit of making a pot of coffee the night before, so I just have to tiptoe past the children's bedrooms in the dark, heat up a cup in the kitchen, and then I start. I don't wait for inspiration or the ideal place and time. I tell myself that any time and place where I'm alone with my laptop and my thoughts is as ideal as it's going to get. Sometimes I write a little, and sometimes I write a lot. I'm never too ambitious, and tell myself that it's better to write something than nothing. Poor work can be improved, but you can't do much with a blank page. And when the children bounce in on me in the kitchen and I make breakfast, hunt for homework and uniforms, and then dash off for the train to work, I'm in a great mood. I usually carry on writing on the train for the hour until I get to campus. And I remind myself that being a writer isn't a complicated thing. It doesn't need to involve calming rituals and high-tech trickery, and a beautiful environment, or even a mind uncluttered with the everyday. Although that would be nice sometimes. A writer is simply someone who has found the time to write.
Okay, I think we can agree that Rupa Farooqi is a goddess.
Absolutely. We all need that potion.
Yes. I will wake up at 5 a.m. for that portion. But yeah, so she's wow. And she has a great writing tip for those of us with kids and busy lives, which is to wake up first thing in the morning and write for a couple of hours. And I may consider doing that if I can ever get out of bed before 7. What do you suggest?
I think there were lots of things here that Rupa said, which I always advise to people I mentor as well. Things like, if you wait for the right moment, it's never going to arrive, especially if you have busy lives, and especially as a parent, you just have to find any time you have.
Sure.
There are no right conditions. There's no routine that you have to stick to, because I know a lot of writers propose that you need to have a routine. I think you have to be adaptable. You have to be flexible. You just have to find 5 minutes is enough sometimes to just jot down some notes in your phone, or to look up a link, or find some kind of motivation, or find some interesting factoid for your book or something like that. I think I do a lot of that. I have a lot of notes in my phone that I then come back to when I have a longer stint, a longer period of time to do that. It's about just being able to find the conditions that work for you and to be able to slot your writing in. I think the main challenge that I had was to claim this writing life and say, I think writing is really very important for me. I need to find time for it. I think that is something that sometimes we don't do. Sometimes we are struck by imposter syndrome and say, I can't call myself a writer. I'm not really a writer, especially if you haven't got any books published, or if you haven't published anything, or if you're in early parts of your career. You can say, how can I justify taking time away for it? But I think being able to claim that is something really empowering, and that is sometimes the first step. During lockdown, for instance, I had 2 small children under the age of 4, and also my older child was there as well, and we were all stuck in this house. And so I found a little corner in my garden behind my shed, and I squeezed a chair in it with my laptop, and I sat there and I would write until my children found out that that's where I was disappearing to. So I've written in the toilet, I've written in my office with my child under the table, giving them some coloring to do. So you just have to, I think, say, this matters to me, and just be able to fit it around the life that you have.
Yeah. I think there's this idea that a writer's life is incredibly orderly, that there's a time when you write, there's a time when you stop, there's the number of words that you should be writing. But the truth is that that's not how writers work.
No.
The life of most creative people is one of chaos, and which is not necessarily a bad thing, because from that chaos emerges great ideas and great projects. But I guess for me, I have an 8-year-old. One thing that I do miss is time to do nothing, because I find that a lot of my writing gets done when I'm not writing. I'm just thinking of ideas, or maybe, thinking through the process or reading. Do you have that challenge at all?
Yeah, I think finding the headspace is really, really challenging. Even when I'm writing, there's always a pressure. And also there's this pressure that, for instance, if I'm working in the library, or if I have 2 hours before they come back from school, I know that the time is finite and I have to make something of it.
Right.
And I think that sometimes creativity is hampered by that kind of pressure. As you say, we need time to imagine and to think and to just wonder and to look at things, look closely at things around us. So I'm trying to do more of that. I'm trying to not put that pressure that I have to turn out a certain number of words within that period that I have, because everything contributes to writing, as you say. So I do find that creativity works in strange ways. And so although being a parent can be challenging for your creative output and creativity, it has also encouraged my creativity a lot as well, because it gives my brain that time to make connections just when I'm cooking for them or when I'm reading to them. I discover new ideas. Just talking to them, I'd find new ideas. Just doing things, mundane things around the house with them, which takes time away from the actual writing, can help me form those connections and come up with some new ideas for my work.
Pragya, let's turn to something else that you're exceptionally good at, which is science writing. There is a long tradition of making scientific ideas accessible to the general public. Darwin, Rachel Carson, Yuval Noah Harari, your books. Here's Brian Clegg speaking to Caroline Sanderson about his motivations for translating science for a broader audience.
I don't think it's quite so much the case now, but when I was at school, by the time you got into the sixth form, you had to be either in a science stream or an arts stream. You couldn't do both. My ideal, I think, probably would have been to have done English and science, but I wasn't allowed to. And the writing, as I say, did continue. I did write in the background anyway. And when I was working at British Airways, which I did for 17 years as my only real job, I started writing for computer magazines because I was involved in computers quite a lot then. I think it started because one of the magazines actually asked me to review this interesting new product called Excel that nobody knew what it was going to be about. And from that, I then thought, well, I like this writing business, and started sending off things to magazines, and it gradually took over my life, really.
You referred earlier to the fact that during the pandemic, we've been confronted really with the vital way in which science can impact every single one of us. And one might also say, given that we're recording this on a day of record-breaking high temperatures, that an understanding of climate science, not least from our politicians, is becoming ever more vital. So you've been a full-time writer for more than 20 years. Do you feel that the value of what you do is becoming more evident or more urgent, maybe even?
I'd certainly see an urgency. It's not enough, I think, to have an emotional response to things like the environment. You have to understand the science behind it. And, if we think of the temperatures rising at the moment, as you say, understanding climate change is a bigger picture, and we need to get our heads around quite a lot of different aspects of science to be able to understand that. Particularly, I suspect, because a lot of our politicians probably come from not scientific background. They typically, may come from an arts or politics background in terms of their degree. They can struggle particularly. I almost feel we ought to have a resident science writer in the House of Commons to explain to the politicians what it's all about.
Pragya, you started out as an academic and you still remain one, but your books are incredibly accessible. Can you talk about the decision to write in a way that feels to me like something that I could just read anywhere, because the storytelling combined with the data is so compelling?
Thank you. I'm glad it comes across like that, Sonia. I think that's been one of my aims with the books that I've written. But as an academic, I think slowly I was becoming a little bit more disillusioned with who we were writing for and what purpose it was achieving. We can't be personal. We can't bring an I, especially in science writing. It has to be completely rational and objective, which I also question about how objective we can really be as scientists and as researchers. And I was wondering, who is it really reaching, who is reading these, what impact it is having. And as Brian said in this clip, I think it's correct that a lot of people who are actually using this academic research or the science writing in academia are not trained in how to interpret that, especially in media or in politics. And so there's a huge gap between the writing and the people who are using this writing in societies. Because until it's actually reaching the people and the society and it's having an actual impact on the ground, I don't know how we can justify that, and also what purpose is it serving. And so storytelling is such a powerful means of communicating ideas. But there's always been this gap between storytelling and science writing for a very long time. And I think we really need to bridge that gap. It's not just for social impact, but also to actually, I find that within education, and I have a lot to say about how science is taught at schools, students often don't understand why they're even studying some of these ideas and what is the point of it all. And I think when we communicate those ideas in a way that is accessible, there is a point to it. You define the point of this research, you define the point of these ideas, you define the point of implementing these ideas within a social cultural context. But also, I'm really interested in interdisciplinarity. And I think in academia, sometimes you're kind of slotted into specific boxes. You can't veer outside these kind of disciplinary frameworks. And a lot of the time, you have to look beyond your particular discipline, or you have to integrate a lot of these ideas to be able to make sense of them. And that's what I'm really interested in.
What are some of the most significant ideas that you think scientists need to translate for the mainstream?
I think, as we just heard, climate science, I think, is one of the biggest concerns or global issues that we are facing at the moment. But often people dissociate from them because either they're pitched at a really high level where we don't understand what is the impact on our everyday lives or what's going to be the impact on us in the future. We see these graphs and data, and it's not really possible for everybody to be able to interpret them. Often it can be translated into things like, oh, if you recycle, then it's okay. But we don't really know what impact our every action is having. And so some of those ideas get lost. And I also feel that it's really important to understand it in a kind of an intersectional global perspective as well, because most of the marginalized minorities, communities are the ones who are getting most impacted by climate change. And that data is getting lost as well, that in policy making, I think. There's a very Western ethnocentric perspective still on climate science or climate change that we are looking at. And we are not considering how different parts of the world are being impacted.
Can I just ask, if I were an academic seeking to get into the sort of science writing that you do, what is the one thing that would make the difference to how I write?
I think it's a constant challenge for me as well still to break away from the academic training that I've had. My editor often tells me it sounds academic, and I'm thinking it doesn't sound academic at all, because that's not how I would write for an academic journal. So there's always this push and pull between the training I've had. I think just trying to grasp the basic central concept of the work that you're trying to make accessible or trying to convey to the people. Say, this is, in 2 lines, in 2 statements, this is what I want to convey to somebody through my writing. And then tell a story around it. As academics, we get caught up in the research, in the citations, in the referencing, in making sure everything is like fully validated and we're not kind of speaking on somebody's behalf. But all that stuff sometimes takes over the actual story we are trying to tell. And I think focusing sometimes on the people whose stories we are telling can be a really powerful way of conveying that idea.
That's terrific advice. Focus on people. I love that. All right. We are now going to move on to our 5th theme, and it's one that makes many writers cringe. It's talking about success. It's an elusive concept for many writers, and it's one that writers tend to define differently. Some define it by commercial triumph, others by internal fulfillment. For those of us who juggle multiple roles, writer, academic, parent, activists, how do we reconcile external validations with our deeper personal aspirations? So let's talk about that. But first, let's listen to Claire Harmon, a nonfiction author who found satisfaction in a somewhat unconventional approach to poetry.
I think I've had probably about 8 poems now published altogether over the years. And one of them then won the Forward Prize for Best Single Poem of the Year, which actually was the most surreal experience of my life. I think standing on the stage of the Royal Festival Hall and thinking, oh my goodness, I've published a poem that people have recognised. I mean, out of this tiny little body of poems, it was only 4 poems at the time that I published. I didn't even know the Forward Prize for a single poem existed. And suddenly I was on the shortlist because the TLS put me in for it. And then I won the thing. So that was like a sort of magic wand of recognition. So I've had the most recognition I could possibly have had on the smallest conceivable publishing history, which in itself is the kind of tip of a not very large iceberg of private writing. So I've had the the most gratification one could possibly... What more could one want? I couldn't want anything better than that. So, hooray. My true genre is the one that has given me the most satisfaction and has bothered the reading public least. Nobody has to like them. They don't have to be good. They don't have to be frequent. I can write terrible poems and I'm not going to be criticised for it. It's the perfect way to be a writer.
That was great. Pragya, this is a tricky one. How do you define success?
Gosh, yes, it is a challenging one. I have constantly been reflecting on that, especially in the last few years, about what success means to me. And I'm constantly surprised when somebody says a successful writer like you. When somebody says that to me, I feel like, am I really successful? And that has made me really think about what would success mean to me? Because I still feel like I haven't achieved the success that I want. But I've had books published and they've been read by people and people sent me feedback that they really enjoyed them. And that is a huge accomplishment in itself, that I'm doing all this, juggling everything. I feel like a society really emphasizes these forms of external validations like prizes and awards and being reviewed in certain things and all those kind of things. I think from an early childhood, I grew up seeking those external validations. And then you realize actually what really matters is how I feel about my work, or what just even a small body of readers feel about my work. And so for me, success is being able to write, having the time to write. And if it reaches a certain audience, if it touches a particular reader and they take the time to send me a message saying, this is the first time I saw myself in a book, or I really enjoyed this book, I've recommended it to people, that means so much, because that personal connection is something that I think we're all craving. And this is why we write. I've been thinking a lot about why I write. And I think focusing on the why has really made me stop looking for these kind of external validations or feeling dejected that I haven't won this award, or I wasn't shortlisted for that, or I wasn't put forward for that, or all those kind of things. I think just focusing on why I'm writing, why am I doing all this, has been really the key.
I know I keep saying everything you say is beautiful, but that is beautiful. I think for me, success is just the fact that I can write, that I have the privilege of writing, of completing a manuscript, of getting published. I mean, that's a huge deal. I think 8-year-old me would be very impressed. I think 8-year-old you would be very impressed.
I think that, you're absolutely right. It's a privilege to be able to put these words out. And, success also meant when my 8-year-old twins, I have twins, 8-year-old twins, and at school they were asked on Women's Day, do you know any writer or feminist writer? And they said, our mom writes these amazing feminist books. And it was a huge moment for me. It was success.
No greater validation. Oh my gosh, you win. Pragya, thank you for giving us such a compelling look into your journey. It's been such a privilege to talk to you.
It's been so great. Thank you so much, Sonia.
And to our listeners, we'd love for you to be part of this conversation. What topics do you want to hear about next? Who would you like us to interview? Please connect with us on social media using the hashtag #RLFcollected. Your questions, comments, and suggestions shape the conversations we bring to future episodes. Thank you so much, and see you next time.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag #RLFcollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.